Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at Team Consulting's Lunch and Learn session today. My name's Simon Grover, and I'm joined today by Joshua Sheard and Oscar Mackay. Today we're going to talk to you about how to ensure robotic compatibility for your surgical innovation. So, surgical robotics is a broad area, and today we're going to focus more on soft tissue robotics. So that's the type of robotic systems that are aimed at traditionally laparoscopic type procedures, as you can see here in the picture. These types of systems tend to cover the majority of robotic procedures and cases that are undertaken at the moment, but by no means all of them. Other systems might include things like orthopedic systems for knees or endoscopy type catheter-based systems. But like I say, we're going to focus more on the soft tissue robotics, general surgical systems today. And so we'll start with a bit of background and state of the market, and where these things are used and how, and then get into the robotic compatibility part of our talk and have some time for Q&A at the end. So we thought we'd start with a bit of background on the state of the market. And Intuitive has dominated this market for the past 20 years, and that's partly due to their patents, and that now there are more companies now trying to enter this space. That's partly due to these patents expiring and giving other companies freedom to operate. We've shown a few of these companies here on the slide, but it's by no means all of them. And they range from large multinationals down to smaller startups. Now, due to complexity and advanced technologies, the development of these devices requires significant investment, and that can be a bit of a barrier to developing a system like this. So to give you an idea of what sort of investment we're talking about, CMR Surgical has raised over $1 billion over the 9 years they've been going, which is a lot of money, but interestingly, Intuitive Surgical at the moment are reported to have increased their annual R&D budget to a similar number, and that's annual. So lots of money goes into these devices to develop them and keep developing them. Now, so although these systems are all aimed at the same kind of procedures and market, it's quite interesting how they have slightly different approaches. So some are a more immersive user experience, whereas others are going for a much more open sort of framework and experience. Some have gone with wristed instruments, whereas others have stuck to more traditional straight stick laparoscopic style instruments, veering less away from that approach. Some are with arms that are individually mounted and positionable around the bed, whereas some go with a single column with all the arms mounted to it. And so there's also some systems out there where the surgeon is remote or semi-remote, but not within the sterile field. And some other systems that are coming in as well now, looking at having the surgeon on the console still scrubbed in and essentially in the sterile field, so you could switch between the robotic control or manual. And so soft tissue robotics is still a challenging market to enter. Partly this is due to regulatory clearance is demanding due to the complexity of these devices. And as such, Intuitive, the only company with a system available globally, with CMR and Medtronic not yet cleared for use in the US, and some of the other ones we have up here have no clearance to operate or have not even really shown what their systems look like yet. Now, although more widely used than ever, there is still only clinical data to support the equivalence of robotic surgery compared to traditional laparoscopic surgery, and that's another challenge to selling these systems and getting more acceptance with them. Although they do offer other benefits, which we'll talk about a bit later. The systems are complex and expensive from the hospital's point of view, but with more players entering the market, we might expect to see this start to change over the course of time with that extra competition. I think another big challenge to entering this market is, Intuitive have been going at this for a lot longer than anyone else, so they have a significant head start, not only just in the technology and everything they've learned and the data they've gathered over that time, but they've also developed networks and have access to hospitals and supply chains, not least just to support their robots as well as sell them across their whole global install base. And this will be challenging, particularly more for the startup companies to compete with. Obviously, the likes of Medtronic's and Johnson & Johnson will probably have similar frameworks in place and be able to scale that more easily and quickly. And so, moving on, we thought it would also be useful to provide a bit of background on the types of procedures these systems are used in. But before I get into that, I wanted to talk a bit about the benefits that you get from a robotic assisted surgical system. One of the big benefits is kind of the wristed instruments. They provide the surgeon with much more dexterity compared to a laparoscopic instrument. So that makes things like suturing specifically much easier. With that wristed action, you can tie knots and pass the needle around much more easily than with a straight stick equivalent. The systems also allow a much increased accuracy and precision due to being able to scale movements. So you can scale a movement from the surgeon input at the console and scale that right down to a much more precise and small movement at the surgical instrument tip, allowing for much more finer dissection or precision of control on where you want to cut or things like that. Another really big benefit is to the surgeon and the ergonomics. With traditional laparoscopic surgery, surgeons are stood at the bedside, bending over the patient, quite often with their arms in a raised position to use the instruments through the ports. And this is quite an uncomfortable position for lower back, for leaning over, but also with the elbow raised above the shoulder. With the robotic systems, the surgical consoles offer a lot more adjustability, and you can get yourself into a comfortable position, but also switch between positions. So a number of them do standing and sitting positions, and you can move between during the surgery if you like. So getting into the procedures, in the UK, robotic assisted surgery has become very popular in urology, specifically with prostate surgery, and is probably the preferred method of performing that surgery if the option's available. But it's also widely used in general surgery, gynecology, and colorectal surgery. I mean, it's also used in other specialties as well, but it's generally popular in procedures where access is limited, involving tight spaces and cramped, or even in areas where access is almost impossible by any other means. The robot-assisted surgery also offers potential to enable new approaches, and so what we mean by this is, at the moment, manual laparoscopic procedures are semi-limited by the surgeon and where they can reach, and the position of the ports that they can get to and use the tools through. Obviously, with a robotic system, you're no longer limited by that. You can position the arms, assuming the robot will let you do so, wherever you like. And that should give rise to varying approaches for procedures, or potentially even new procedures altogether. So now I'm going to pass over to Josh, who's going to show you a bit about what this looks like in a surgical setting.
Thank you, Simon. I will just provide a very quick overview covering the typical surgical context in which a robotic system may operate. So a robotic procedure is contingent on a team of clinicians being able to complete a range of often quite complex surgical tasks within the surgical field. and of course have to ensure at all times that sterility is maintained. So as you can see from the schematic on the page there, within the sterile field you may have an assistant surgeon and scrub nurse working at the bedside. The surgical robot, of course, within the sterile field as well, it would be draped. It has to be draped with sterile drapes, again, to maintain sterility. Outside of the sterile field, you'll have a circulating nurse or technologist who will be handing off devices to the scrub nurse in using sterile technique. As has already been mentioned, some systems allow the surgeon to be scrubbed in and able to move to the bedside. So it's definitely in the case of the distal motion system. In most cases, the surgeon is currently located out of the sterile field. And that's some key differences you may see there. I think as with all surgeries, an operating theatre is a busy environment, often with limited space for movement. So the surgical robot really adds an additional dynamic, as the robotic arms are constantly moving from static to active states in order to reach different tissue targets. And these complex interactions between clinicians and the system should always be considered when developing a new device. Different roles and use contexts will all generate different user requirements, and some of these will require carefully considered user validation. There are different levels of compatibility which should be considered when designing a device to be used with a surgical robot. So at Team, we believe robotic compatibility can be broadly simplified into 3 groups, each of which consider the ways in which a product is required to interface with a surgical robot. In the fully robotic context, the instrument or accessory being developed is fully integrated and driven by the system, and this development would most likely be driven as a partnership between the robot manufacturer and the accessory developer. Partially robotic interaction allows for the manipulation of an accessory by the robot without the need to adapt capital equipment or the relevant bespoke instrumentation. In some cases, the accessory may be used as an ancillary device, used within the operating field of a surgical robot, but not directly coupling to it or being directly manipulated by it. And I'm going to hand over to Oscar Mackay, who will talk about some of these areas in more detail.
Thank you, Josh. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about each of the 3 levels of compatibility, the first of which being fully robotic. So as Josh said, fully robotic, the instrument or accessory being developed is fully integrated into the system and is driven by the system. We're going to focus largely on multi-port systems. There are differences in the considerations required for multi-port versus single port, but given multi-port is much more commonplace than single port or natural orifice, we're going to focus mainly on that. So a multi-port system is typically constructed of 3 to 5 ports, one of which will be for the scope. They're 8 mm in diameter for the surgical instruments, the surgical tools, but it is commonplace to have an additional port, a larger auxiliary port, in order to get things into the surgical field, or for specialist tools such as vessel sealers or staplers. So you have the option to get things into the surgical field using that larger port. System to system, the system architecture will vary. As Simon talked about previously, they were all designed to achieve slightly different things with a slightly different selling point. Some are very maneuverable and portable, and some of which come from a common stem. So based on that, those considerations are going to change how they're driven. And as a result of that, you're going to need to pick a specific system in order to design for. As a result of that, there's going to be certain specific integration requirements per system, and you're going to need to know quite a lot of detail about that system. So in terms of designing an instrument for a system, the instrument needs to communicate back to the central console. They largely do that using an RFID chip or a sacrificial board. And that has to be able to read and write in order to update things such as instrument life. So if the instrument's reprocessable, the life is stored on the individual instrument itself. Each instrument will have a serial number, and per use that will be rewritten to the instrument that a life has been used. Some systems retract in the Z-axis fully, so in the axis of the trocar. As a result of that, the instrument length is critical. Instrument length also can vary depending on the surgical tool you're using. So grasper to needle driver, etc., the instrument length can be different depending on the system. The port diameter is important. So different systems, some are using a 5 mm port, others are using an 8 mm port. And as we talked about, if it was a single port system, there's only one on the market, and that uses a 25mm port. So that's something you're going to need to factor. Another thing is the power. So all of the systems have different power available. And the main output of that is drive force limitations. So depending on what you need to manipulate and how much force you need to be able to exert, you're going to need to check whether or not there's enough power available to do that. The power is one part of the story, the other is around the mechanical advantage, and that's largely driven by shaft diameter as to how much mechanical advantage you can get. And then the other thing is depending on the drive pack. The drive pack's different on every single system. How the instrument is actuated, where roll comes from, for example, will vary. But depending on the system, you're going to have different amounts of roll pitch and yaw that you can achieve, and that will lead to different splay angles potentially, and that's something to check. And I think the main point here is that fully robotic compatibility is difficult to achieve without partnering with that system. You're going to be developing for a specific system, and therefore it would only be compatible to that system, and that system would therefore require exclusivity to that technology. So they're the sort of key considerations for fully robotic. Now I'll move on to partially robotic. So partially robotic, just to recap. So this allows for the manipulation of an accessory by the robot without adaptation of the robot itself. So essentially the tool or accessory becomes an extension of the robot once it's inside the surgical field. The key considerations for this to design for use with the most common instruments used in specific procedures. There are challenges with this, surgical preference for the surgeon. So while the instruments commonly used for a specific procedure will be similar, certain surgeons may prefer specific grasper profiles to other grasper profiles, for example. And the other thing to factor is variation between systems. So while a Maryland grasper profile is a defined profile, there may be subtle differences between systems. So ensure that if you're trying to pick up this instrument and use anchoring pips, similar to the image on the right there, it's just to ensure that you're compatible with the broadest range of systems on the market. The other thing is to consider triangulation. So in multi-port robotic surgery, triangulation is very similar to manual lap. You have perhaps slightly better dexterity as a result of the wristed instruments, but the surgical field is largely the same. The only thing to consider is by putting something on the end of the instrument is just to ensure you can still reach the tissue and achieve what you need to achieve based on the current port locations. In terms of placement, so largely you're going to need to get your tool or accessory into the surgical field using an auxiliary port. You need to sort of control insertion or dragging of the tubes, as Josh talked about before. Robotic surgical system setup is quite busy. There's quite a lot going on. Just need to ensure that there's no kinking or dragging of any cables as a result of the robotic arms in situ. And then the other thing is, so this is a gamma probe on the right. They can be quite heavy, just to consider the payload limitations of a given system. Now, some systems have been shown that they can sort of lift up organs and hold them out the way during procedures. So in terms of payload, they can manipulate and hold fairly large payloads, but it's just a consideration to take into account. So this device on the right, this is the Sensei probe, which was developed by Lightpoint Medical. At Team, we think this is a really nice development. One of the things we really like about it is that it's not limited to robotic surgery. So this enters the surgical field using a 12mm port, and it's compatible with manual lap instruments as well as robotic instruments, wristed instruments. And one of the key things we really like is these little pips. They allow for the tool to be gripped axially, so sort of translated 90 degrees to how the image shows, and in that configuration there. And they've used a sort of nice robust anchoring system, and we think this is a really nice example of partially robotic compatibility. Another consideration just to take into account is to ensure that display angles, so in this case it's not so bad, but just to ensure that the instrument can open up wide enough and can close down hard enough on the tool or accessory to ensure that you have sort of robust anchoring of that. The third tier of compatibility is ancillary operation. This is where an accessory is used as an ancillary device. The device is used within the operating field of a surgical robot, but is not actuated or manipulated by it. I think the key consideration here is limited patient access. So as we've talked about, these robots are large, and some of them come from one side of the surgical bed, and others have modular systems where they have arms sort of positioned all the way around the patient and the surgical bed. And as a result of that, this in situ robot limits the access that the surgeon can have to do any manual operation. And so the placement of the auxiliary port to ensure access to the surgical site that they're looking to get to, but also to allow the surgeon to get to that port, is going to be really important. In terms of port sizes, we've touched a little bit on that. I've put the port size diameters there again, but it's not necessary to use a system-specific trocar. You can, whichever sort of trocar that is used by that hospital or that surgeon, they can use whichever trocar they wish to use. Another interesting point is around sort of the self-awareness of different systems. So a surgical system that comes from a common stem, for example, the robot knows all the joint angles for all of the arms, and therefore can infer the position relative to each other. I think that's particularly important in terms of avoiding clashing. Modular systems, the joint angles for every module is known, but where those modules sit in proximity to one another, that is not known. But none of the systems have any awareness of any sort of additional apparatus within the room. Some systems allow you to move the elbow out of the way, which can improve patient access. The system will maintain a virtual pivot point and allow you to move that elbow out of the way, and that just gives the surgeon more access, or circulating nurse, this is more access to the patient. And the big consideration here is around integration and storage. So adding a manual or an additional tool into the procedure. If you require pneumatics or additional power, it's important to consider where that's going to come from within the OR. Are you going to need an additional stack? Can you pull power from the current stack? As we've sort of talked about, it's a crowded environment, and adding additional power stacks or generators into the mix is going to be challenging for space. So there are key considerations and thoughts for the 3 levels of compatibility. Thank you for listening to our presentation. We'd now like to answer some of your questions.
So just to begin with, what would you say is the most critical factors in design trade-off going from manual to robotic procedures?
It's a good question. I think it could be quite a broad question. I think one of the big trade-offs you get from going from manual to robotic is kind of the lack of tactile feedback. When you're actually using laparoscopic instruments, manual ones, you'll be able to feel the grip and the tissue feeding back through the mechanism of the tool. Obviously, with a surgical system, robotic system at the moment, there's none out there that really give you that feedback. That could be a development that will come in time, but I think that's definitely one big trade-off that you get between the two areas. I don't know if anyone else has got any other thoughts.
Okay, so moving on to the second question, thanks for that, Simon. Where do you see surgical robotics not being adopted in the next 10 or so years?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at this from the perspective, I guess, of an engineer and developer rather than a clinician. That's to be sure. But I think where there's a clinical need within perhaps elective surgery, then yes, I think there's lots of areas which could be explored. There are lots of areas which probably have unmet needs that we simply don't know about at the minute that could be improved with surgical help. I think, going very much on just feel for things such as trauma. It doesn't feel with the technology available now that is perhaps the best place for robotics. But that's also famous last words, because within 10 years, the whole thing could flip completely the other way, with impacts from things such as AI, just the way robots are changing outside of the surgical world as well. So yeah, I would, my view is definitely within elective surgery, it's a case, I guess an enthusiastic engineer is looking at it to say never, let's have a go. But of course, it should always be driven by a clinical need. And that's what's important to explore.
Yeah, I suppose emergency surgery, like kind of as Josh was saying, it's never the setup time perhaps limits that being an option. Perhaps that's something that can be addressed, but I think the timing to get the OR ready for an emergency procedure is going to be challenging. Patients who are sort of high risk of cardiac arrest, they won't be proceeded on. They won't have a robotic procedure, for example. And I think pediatric procedures potentially as well. Smaller patients, less developed tissues. I suppose they're less likely to be able to have operations based on the current size of the instruments and the ports required.
Yeah, I think there's also a slight irony there, isn't there, that the systems were originally funded for military purposes to help injured soldiers on the battlefield, and actually that kind of trauma scenario is something that they don't really cover yet. I think another thing that might limit their use is if there's a very quick, easy manual way of doing something, the robot is more likely to take longer and add extra cost, and you'll see less benefits to the surgeon through the ergonomics because it's such a quick procedure. So those sorts of procedures might still remain more manual.
So thanks for that. So another question we've had through is there a need for a tool change during surgery, and is this assisted by the nursing or surgical staff?
Yes, of course. There are multiple tool changes or instrument changes throughout a procedure. It's all about a cohesive team being able to operate together to make that happen. Certainly you will see, a circulating nurse would maybe need to hand off, using sterile technique, a single-use device which must pass across to the scrub nurse, and it will be led by potentially a surgeon calling for an instrument change on a particular arm. There's a big interaction there. It's an important critical task within the surgical workflow. It's absolutely critical that things get in there quickly, coupled to the robot, and they can crack on with the surgery. So yeah, absolutely, you'll see multiple tool changes, instrument changes throughout the procedure.
Thanks for that, Josh. So another question we've had is it easier to design the proximal side of a surgical tool for integration with the human hand or the robotic arm?
Yeah, I think that's a
question.
Interesting question. The key challenge is then the big difference at the proximal end between manual lap and robotic is the additional degrees of freedom as a result of the wristed instruments. So that's going to make the proximal end slightly more complicated based on the drive pack and the power for that. And I suppose manual lap instruments have got sort of large pistol grip handle, and you can get a lot of mechanical advantage and a large force out of a manual instrument. You have a much shorter stroke on the robotic instrument, so that can be a challenge.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and actually the robot almost acts as just an extension. You're still putting something in a surgeon's hand and at one end, but it's just on the console now. So I think it also ties back a bit to what we were talking about earlier about feedback. They'll get less feedback from the tool, and a less customized handle for a specific tool, which you would get from a manual laparoscopic instrument. Were you going to say something as well, Josh?
No, I was nodding in agreement. It's a great question.